Greetings and welcome to The Hidden Palace, the show where we talk with experts and enthusiasts about video game preservation. My name is Bo. I'm at the controls again for another episode of the show, and I have some experts with me. We've got Saz.
Hello again.
We've got DRX.
What's up?
And we've got a special guest, another expert, Jason Scott. Jason Scott, welcome to The Hidden Palace.
Glad we made this work.
We have made it work indeed. The subject for our episode tonight is a project of biblical flood proportions. We're talking about Project Deluge, one of the Hidden Palace greatest hits. And unlike some of the things we've talked about on previous episodes, this is an ongoing project, if I understand correctly. And I may not understand all of this correctly because I was not paying attention to retro gaming or preservation or anything in the area when this all started. So I'm going to start. Can you tell me, what is Project Deluge?
Project Deluge was a coordinated effort to take a provided cache of press and pre-release materials that were designed to officially be used for news and releases over the course of a number of years. And it involved having not just one or 20 or 50, but a couple thousand different discs in various states of physical and digital decay, and to assess them, go through them, figure out which ones were actually unique, because they had not been collected with the sense of preservation. The entities behind it had just thrown it into a bin because they were done doing different work in different places, until finally there was, just a pile. And it just turned out to be an incredibly important and incredibly valuable pile for history, because it was many different programs, games, platforms, but that value made it something that I and others who had been offered it, we knew it was going to be either experts going through it, or it was going to become unpleasant for people to interact with. I mean, you don't want to dump 7,500 of something or 3,500 of something into the world. So you needed a team of experts. And there's a very famous quote from the guy who created SendMail, Eric Allman, one of the first mail handlers. And he said, "My project was a sledgehammer designed to kill a fly that turned out to be an elephant in the distance." And Project Deluge has turned out to be an elephant in the distance. Maybe we thought it was a hamster or a groundhog, but it's an elephant. It turns out that it was the equivalent of a university's library of material. And Hidden Palace turned out to be the group that was up for the job that seemingly never ends, of turning it from a cool bin to find into an actual, real, presented library of lost, forgotten, or differently enabled materials.
Well said. And could you confirm for me, my understanding is that the material covered is mostly the mid to late 90s through the mid to late aughts. Is that right?
I'd say yes, unless the experts have a different opinion. It was from the world of gaming magazines and newsletters and so on that existed in the 90s, where there was a real, back and forth, quid pro quo with gaming companies. It was in their best interest to ensure that their games were reviewed the same month they were released. And so they were more than happy to send over materials, but they had not quite gotten to the point of locking things down with watermarking, NDA level digital vault access that you might get now. It was still a little bit wild. So you would be mailed a CDR that had been burned, and on it was a Sonic game that was hoping to come out in 6 months. And you would get to play it and you could have a review for it. And if everything worked out, and it didn't always work out, you'd have a review the same month as a game that has come out. Sometimes the game would come out without a review, and sometimes the review had to be spiked at the last moment because they decided never to release the game. So it was quite a ballet, something people I think now don't know. But at the time, it required literally sending plastic through the mail. And usually you would then throw out the plastic after you were done with it, except some people didn't.
Yeah, and thank God those people exist, because they saw the value in holding on to these discs long after the publisher would have even cared about it. And thankfully they wound up in the right hands to show to the world.
And I think there's something to be said for the fact that we've discussed talking about the kind of the world of collectors, the world of people who are into retro computing, and of course the people who are students of certain types of games and game series and franchises, and how this kind of overlays across all of them, because buried in these are not just like a version of Sonic that doesn't have the right menus, but actual proof of like, this is the direction they thought they were going in. Here's the music they thought they were going to do. Or here's proof that a musician worked on this, even though there's, no hint of them in the final work. Things like that, like actual citational evidence, which, in the aggregate of the world, you can find many more important things. But I think for the amount of effort and the amount of life and world that we put into video games, it's nice to be able to know. We know every publisher Charles Dickens talked to when he was trying to get his books made, and this helps us understand what different positions different franchises played at these video games over the years, whether they thought they were going to make this, but it's a card game, or this, but it's a racing game, or not. And so its value for the currency, assuming you accept the currency, is nearly priceless.
So we have this flood of discs. Some of them are the final build that got released to retail. Some of them are nearly the final build, save for a few bug fixes or polishing touches. And some of them are canceled that never came out or saw the light of day, as you mentioned. And then some of them are earlier previews of things that might have been. What do we think the people's favorite highlights of the lot have been so far?
I was actually surprised by the response from the first release we did, which was PlayStation 2. I think we started out with like around 500 discs from PlayStation 2. We were able to whittle that down, like take away some of the finals or things that already were like released prior that matched. I think we whittled that down to 349, which that's still a big number. That's still a huge number for these types of releases. There was a few highlights for me. I think when we did the Xbox lot, there was one. There was a build of Toe Jam and Earl 3, or Toe Jam and Earl. I think was the working title was All Funked Up. That I'm actually a big fan of Toe Jam and Earl 3, despite its reputation. The developers of the new Toe Jam and Earl game, while we were doing the stream for the showcase stream for it, actually showed up in our Twitch chat. Now, obviously, they're kind of there just to promote the Toe Jam and Earl for that they either had just released or were releasing. But it was still kind of a highlight for me just to see like a developer, or at least developer adjacent, show up in our Twitch chat to talk about the game like unprompted.
Well, that is cool too, because a lot of this is done in a very unofficial capacity, but that does lend it a stamp of approval from the people who make the game. Like, they are enthusiastic about it the way we're enthusiastic about it, we hope, and it's good when that comes true.
There's always a profound tension there, right? Which is, I have dealt with some developers who are so terrified of just problems, right? Getting back to them. And I think the winner for me is there's a demo for the Atari 800. It's from 1979. And when I first got emulation working on the browser, we were using the Atari demo as a demonstration. And through an intermediary, in other words, they wouldn't even talk to me, the original creator contacted us to let us know that the port of MAME that we were using gets the colors wrong for this particular object on it, and it should be fixed. And I said, wow, I'd love to talk to him about this and some other things. And the intermediary was like, no, he doesn't want to come anywhere near this. And I'm like, he's not been at Atari for at least 40 years. And he's like, yeah, no, won't go near it. So, you have to understand that like some of these folks, these engineers, especially the earlier ones, they come up through like, quasi-military, multinational companies that have floating contracts, and they're grown up in a era of this stuff is all skunk works and not to be discussed, and don't even show people where you work and don't have a business card. I've spoken with a lot of developers at the end of their productive lives when they've retired. I'm think of like, David Crane, who did Pitfall. He still made a new game recently, but it's very much like a victory lap, more of a thing, as opposed to a career. He's not hitting refresh hoping his paycheck comes in. He's done this. And I think for all of them, there's nothing but a sense of distance, but a kind of, to me, sad distance of like so much of their work output and their product gone, like just no evidence of it. Newspaper descriptions of the work they were doing, but like day to day, how they did it, how they taught people, what tricks they learned, like that's gone. But there's so much other work where there's not even a list of every Sonic. Like there just isn't, because it was too disparate. It was too spread over too many groups. We're still going to be discovering Sonics for the next 20 years because I'm sure, having been on the other side of having, Sega yell at me, Sega cares about Sonic, but they don't necessarily care about like keeping track of every failed project, just which ones make it. So without the amateurs, they're gone.
And we actually get prototypes from the developers themselves nowadays for a bunch of indie games. Like people have started trying to promote their game through Hidden Palace by giving us like, hey, here's a bunch of prototypes, plug my game. Which, that's an interesting development. I didn't think that was coming up.
Yeah, I was on the board of a video game display in Australia. I think it's going to be traveling now. It's about video game environments and worlds and everything else, right? And this won't have the same strength or effect that it had at the time. But one of their displays was a top-down kind of overview of the development of the Silk Song sequel, right? And so Team Cherry worked with this museum so that the month that it was released, the newest version, you could go to this museum and be able to actually walk through different levels and be able to see how they built the layers and how they built the maps and everything else. Like that's the day of release, right? Like that means they had to be working for a year with them towards their last year to say, and we're handing this over to the museum. We're going to let them like turn it into a display. And here's all of our sketches and here's all of our scanned material. And they probably just handed it over to them to say, please turn these into, digital forms. I think that to me, it's very exciting. And for the people who are listening in the podcast who were like very surprised, like, I thought this was going to be about like, disassembling the disk reading code so it'll work better on a Windows 11 box. It's like, no, like that's bones. I've always said, like, these are bones. You can always read bones. You can be like, oh, somebody died here. Here's the bones. Oh, there's some scuff marks. They clearly struggled before they died. But you don't find out who they loved. You don't find out what their favorite food was or what their dreams were before they met this end. And by doing the work we're doing, and when developers are talking to us, and when people are giving us their in-process and motivations and everything else, that's the ligaments, the muscles, the skin, the eyes that are giving us like where these bones were from. Otherwise, if that's too mushy for you, man, it's always TOSEC. It's always no intro. Go download a zip file, call it a day, go home. Thanks. Enjoy. Run it on a pie. Have a good day.
Yeah, and in a way, Deluge is like an elephant cemetery, right? Of many bones of many elephants. Not just one bone. Like you get one prototype and it's like a bone somewhere and it lacks all the context.
Yeah, sometimes you'll get lucky, you'll get multiple builds of a single game, and that gives you a better picture of the actual like process the team went through during it gives you a sliver of a light in like a very, very narrow sliver of light in that development timeline, and like what they were going through at that time, like what their process was.
Yeah, a really good example is we all knew that like Halo was going to make a battle royale. Like they just couldn't not see that friggin' battle royale money, right? And so they started work on one. I forget its name. It was whatever it was. And then they quickly pivoted away. Like they just decided they couldn't make it work. Who knows? But the point is was that project a series of notes? Is it a couple recorded Zoom meetings? Is it a whiteboard with some photos? Is it a Google Doc? Or is it some built, prototype code where they've tried to drop 75 Master Chiefs into a bowl and see if the engine explodes? Or did they get as far as doing a little couple quiet, play tests and then saying, this isn't any fun and our code can't keep it up. Let's go try to be something else. Like, we don't know. But maybe in another year, maybe in another 5 years or 10 years, suddenly this hard drive drops in people's mailbox and we suddenly go, oh, wow, they were struggling, man. Or maybe we say, oh, I can't believe this didn't happen. And someone said, yeah, couldn't make microtransactions work, had to walk away. Like, why this happened. So much good work is done in creative industries that we never get to see, and we don't get the story. There's so much material involved in, like, say, a let's go with mid 40s Disney, like when they were like really, like they had done it, they had proved that you could do a full length movie. Yeah, we proved we could do Pinocchio. Pinocchio had a lot of stuff, but then it's like, what are we going to do next? What story are we going to tell? Are we going to do this? Are we going to do this? And they're just flailing, trying to figure out, like, do we increase this? Do we do that? Thankfully, asterisk, we have a lot of Disney material, right, that we can now look at, because Disney now recognizes their own history enough to like produce these documentaries and these books. But is EA going to do that? If I had to give odds-on favorite, if I had to go down to Kalshi and make a bet, I'm going to say maybe Blizzard will come out with the big book of like, here's the leather bound, here's how we created this thing. But I mean, I don't even know if Activision remembers what it had for lunch last week. I don't think it's in any shape for its own history like that. Not in the way that I'm thinking of.
And going back to your earlier point about, some engineers get embarrassed, right? Like a company like EA is always going to produce like a very a product, like a documentary produced by EA is going to be a product that puts them in a good light, right? Like they're going to overlook some of the things that we find interesting.
I worked in the game industry. I'll mention that here. I worked in the game industry for about 2 years in my 20s. which is a great time to do it. I worked for a company called Psygnosis, which was purchased by Sony. And I technically worked for an after group of Psygnosis US called Focus Studios, where we were trying to kind of leaf off and do additional work and eventually try to do a video game and so on. I was the art director of that second one. So I got to see kind of the sausage factory from the inside. And I kind of got to see like how really like how much work is being done and how much doesn't get done and what they're trying to do. I got to see 5 unfinished games. I got to see versions of PlayStation games that never came out. One of my white whales, which I think, it's one of these things where I say it's my white whale, and I feel like Hidden Palace would be like, oh yeah, we released that in 2017. What it is many people may not know this, but like from the inside, if the PlayStation hadn't been successful, it would have sunk Sony. Like, it wouldn't have put Sony out of business. It's too big, but they would have had to probably divest some of their factories and, kind of like sell them to Hitachi with a licensing deal so they could still manufacture their goods there. Like, they would have had to do radical financial reorganization if the PlayStation had been a dud.
It was a big gamble.
It was a huge gamble, but not just a gamble like third mortgage gamble, like real serious levels, right? And they blinked in a couple places. And one of the ways they blinked was the original design of the PlayStation had 8 megabytes of RAM. And 7 months before release, the big boys out in Japan basically said, I think we're going to make it 2. Because we really, let's try to cut the cost down. Let's make it so we don't lose as much on every console, right? And, with the advantage of hindsight, you could go, well, of course, you guys should have done it. You should have made it 8 megs, but why'd you make it anemic? Why'd you have a 640 meg storage area and a 2 megabyte RAM? And the answer was they were scared. They were scared about putting that much money in. And so there were a non-zero amount of launch titles that had been developed for 3 or 4 years using 8 megabytes of RAM. And they suddenly discovered they were not going to be coming out in that configuration.
Oh.
And Psygnosis and a couple others had to be sent to some of these companies to help them refactor their work. So I know there's at least 3 or 4 versions of games that only work on mythical 8 megabyte PlayStations, which do exist.
This connects to 2 pieces of information, which one is the dev kit for the PlayStation does have 8 megs, and that must be why. That's what
that's exactly why. Because it was the PlayStation, yeah.
And the second thing is I recently found a demo of Ridge Racer, the #1 serial number for the PlayStation in Japan, that is an early build. You can't normally access it, but the high score screen, if you do hack your way into it, spells out with the initials, I shall kill Sony. And I thought this was a very strange thing to be putting on the high score screen for your Ridge Racer. But I wonder if that's the reason why they had this thing locked and loaded and ready to go, and then they cut their RAM budget.
Yeah. Darkstalkers lost 2 characters. I know that. But the one that I enjoyed was The Adventures of Lomax, which exactly 7 people care about.
I loved that game.
So it had, I believe, 3 more parallax backgrounds that they just had to rip out because there was nowhere to put them anymore. So he did, to the artist who I love, like he had done all these other backgrounds for it, and they just couldn't do them because it just wouldn't work. So yeah, they had to like send people in. And so that is that to me is a fascinating situation where you deal with prototypes that don't even run on the machine because it runs for a machine that doesn't exist. Obviously it does. And obviously a PlayStation emulator worth its salt would have a mode to go into dev kit mode. But at the time I had a blue dev kit that I could borrow from work, and I would take it home and play these games and try them out. We had a situation where Focus Studios when Psygnosis US closed, one of our guys went to go work for the Sony factory in the Midwest, which made all the black discs. And he would send us every disc. So we had every PlayStation disc, right? And there were games that the minimum order was 1,000. Like that was the minimum amount of dupes you could do. We played a few of the 1,000 copy games. And let me tell you, oh my God, because it was clear that this was to fulfill a contractual obligation. Like we promised it would be finished and the insurance and everything. So they put out 1,000. Psygnosis put out a game in, at the time, Czechoslovakia, now Czechia. But they only put out like 50 copies. And they put them in a market in Czechia to claim that they had released it. The game, I believe, is called Zombieville. I forget which one it was. Somebody came to me who had developed it and said, you don't have it listed. And I looked it up. I was like, well, here's why, buddy. But it was like you could find Usenet postings about it at the time where people are like, when I press the S key, it crashes. And I'm like, I bet it does. I bet this thing, like they literally like it's like the Fantastic Four movie that came out just to keep the copyright going. It was like that. There's all these little buried treasures, right? That's where I come in. I loved this world of items that had been part of this supposedly heartless industry that clearly reflected the amount of craftsmanship and work and testing and experimentation, right? And so when I found out that Hidden Palace existed and that they were like making like a bodily good effort to like not just put up an FTP site and say, grab these 7 zips and call it a day, but to like, not just even like, I don't want to trash the other guys. Not just even like be more concerned with perfection in the hash and the description of the tracks than they are about honoring what you have found. Like, in other words, it's like opening a cabin that was used by some explorers who died. And you're like, I'm going to have the first drink at the table and it's going to be to these guys. I'm going to toast the guys who died building this cabin before I go and climb with my equipment and everything. The sense of showmanship that kind of pervades Hidden Palace, it's not just attention grabbing, right? It's like, let's all assemble for a moment. Let's have a bonfire. Let's assemble to respect what we are seeing here because eyes were not meant to see it. And sure, it's a hell of a funny thing when you boot up a version of Sega and Sonic has no eyeballs. But come on, let's all appreciate for a moment that a project that could have easily been on the shelves in this form or could have easily been this never got its moment in the sun, and those developers never saw it and they had to move on, and it's been 10 years and they might not even remember it, or they'll see it and they'll be like, oh god damn, that menu effect, I never used that again, like their relationship to it. That's what Hidden Palace is to me. And that's why when I was contacted as one of the people aware of what was rebranded as the Deluge, I was like, oh yeah, let's not just make a goddamn .rar that's 45 gigabytes long. Let's have real people look this over and treat it like we opened a garage and there was an unrestored 1950s car in there and it's the only one of its kind. Like, let's do that. Let's not do, hey, we found a garbage bag.
Yeah, because we've done that. Like, we've done that before in the past, and like we've like back in like the early like to mid 2000s, like we've done those types of releases, and they sit and people look at like the really like standout things, and then maybe like 10 years later someone will be like, oh, I found this in this build that Hidden Palace released in 2008, and like and it's just been sitting there because nobody looks at it, because if we don't look at it first, it seems like nobody looks at it.
I think the world needs more tour guides. I really do think so. And I would say that like within your community and within the other similar Discord and other communities that people work in, there is a position where if somebody is not an assembly master or is not an expert at unpacking a custom midway texture, there's a place for a person who can help spin an accurate but exciting narrative about what's being looked at. And I think there's room for that among, somebody who feels, man, I can't do anything. I'm just a consumer. I'm just going to wait for the next stream and enjoy it. It's like, yeah, or you could see an unpulled thread in how this was designed. Like, why do so many of these games have such, I'm making stuff up. I can very quickly make stuff up, but like, why are ends formed this way across these 5 games? Why is this N designed in the font like this? And it's like, oh, this one font designer, his name was Nichols, and that was his signature. And he is so joyful that somebody figured that out. And let's go interview him. He doesn't even work in the industry anymore. And let's find out that story of that guy where he's like, I'm under this pressure, but I wanted to have a little piece. I wanted one. You can't, I interviewed Warren Robinett, who did Atari Adventure, and he has had lots of different narratives about the Easter egg, but he was like, they wanted to take all of me out of it. And this was my way of saying, if you think you can get rid of me and who I am in this game, you're sadly mistaken, because I'll always be hiding somewhere deep in your code.
To your point, one of the joys of Hidden Palace for me is, we are the guys who like crunch through 7,000 builds of Deluge or whatever, but there are so many contributors who are not technical, but they play all the builds and they document them. And so, for example, we were talking about the 8 megabyte thing, and I just did a search on Hidden Palace, and there's like a few builds where people have noted that, like a spiral level in a prototype, actually in Deluge, only runs if you have 8 megabytes.
When we were doing Xbox Deluge, there were, like, famously, the dev kit Xboxes only have they have 128 megs of RAM. I think it's 128. Might be 64. Might be getting mixed up, but they have double the RAM of retail Xboxes. And we were doing Xbox Deluge. I took on the task of doing hardware verifications for builds that couldn't run on an emulator for one reason or another. And when I found out that, some of these builds only run on 100 or double the RAM, dev kit RAM, I had to actually go and physically solder in the additional RAM chips on my Xbox just to get screenshots of the build. And I think getting those screenshots is really important, because if you just have a nameless, faceless, like, zip file on a website, no one's going to look at it. But if you go and actually even just take a title screenshot, just something physical that puts it into the physical world, somebody's going to see something, it's going to spark their interest, and they're going to look into it. And there might be something, you didn't expect there. Like, one of the builds, I think, is called like Dead Man's Hand, that required the additional RAM. And when I ran it with that additional RAM, it showed like this little weird, like, it looked like a Quake icon that just says 64 plus megs while you're playing the game at all times. And I thought that was funny, so I put it in the screenshots. And, they're there as just like you said, the tour guide. It's something you can put like a face to the name.
This is something I wanted to get into, which is there is the effort to digitize all this stuff, and there's the effort to document to some degree all this stuff. But then there's a whole lot of effort into just figuring out what it is. And as I understand, this led to some engineering and creating of software to help dedupe things and to interface with the people who are really into the hashes in the track bits and bytes. So let's click on that for a moment.
That was a huge effort, because we started, and it helped that it still is, and it's still ongoing. Just like Deluge, it's still ongoing, and so is the cataloging effort for Deluge builds. And since it was really helpful that we iterated system by system, because what we ended up building was an application that went through every build and essentially hashed every file inside the build and then produced a composite of all of those hashes. And we were able to, compare them against like final builds or builds that were already released and kind of dedupe them that way. Because a lot of times you might get like a final build on like a CDR or DVD-R, and it might have just been burned with like Nero or something, but like everything else is the same. So if you just hash that image, it's going to come up different than the one on the pressed CD, but it's otherwise 100% identical. So you can't just like hash everything and check with the hashes for everything else, because you're going to get mismatches, and then you're going to waste a whole bunch of time researching something that's the final build. So what we ended up having to do is develop a lot, and I mean a lot of tooling just to get all of the bits and bobs of each file on a disk, on a build, to determine whether it was worth going further. And we started with PlayStation 2. PlayStation 2, very simple to work with, basic, file system, nothing special there. Then we go on to Xbox. Okay, Xbox has its own proprietary file system on the disk. You have to parse that file system. The executables may be the same as the final build, but they might be signed for dev kits, but otherwise they're completely identical. Those are typically not worth, doing anything different with. But you have to, in our tooling, we have to mark that as like, okay, we have to get the hash of this build without all the signing information, and get like just the hash of the raw executable like data, and then compare that against the final build so you can, separate that. I had to do the same with like Xbox 360. Once again, it has its own little quirks. We keep having to do this with every system that came up with Deluge. We ended up with this huge library that's able to go through every single disk-based system. Well, at least almost every disk-based system that's been released up to, the late like PlayStation era, like PlayStation 2, some PlayStation 3, because occasionally we get like a PlayStation 3 build, like this project, evolved beyond Deluge. So if we get something coming in from PlayStation 3 for a different lot, then we're able to use that tooling there. Everything has its own quirks, so we have to coalesce it into one library that outputs a nice, easy to read, easy to parse, easy to filter spreadsheet that we were able to use to run pivot tables and do all sorts of like data analysis on, just to quickly filter things down to what we actually need to look at. And that saved us a ton of time. And it was a huge effort, but I'm glad we did that, because it's constantly coming in handy for us, like every day.
It's funny. In my work, in my main job is I'm the free range archivist at the Internet Archive, and that title is very loose. And the reason it is because I put myself in a lot of junctures of places that wouldn't normally have any kind of interface between archivists and procurers of information or individuals and so on. So like one of my jobs is pure diplomacy, pure let's make this happen, let's talk to these folks. I have been in some really weird smelling basements, and I have been in some really incredible, like I spoke at a Library of Congress event about 12 years ago about software preservation. And I gave a talk that was titled, a quote from The Watchman, which was, "I did it 20 minutes ago," which was basically kind of a declaration of like, look, you folks are really trying to figure out how to set the table here, and you're trying to come up with like processes and things. Anyway, I've put up about 100 terabytes of vintage software in various forms, and so speed it up, please. And it worked out in terms of like, we added emulation in the browser, and that's its own project on its own. But like, instead of us taken everyone's time with Jason talks about that. We could do that some other time. Let me just say what the motivation was, which was, software is so fluid and so incredibly easy to lose, and it's so easy to get boring. And, something's in a, dot RTIF format, some format you've never seen before. Now you've got to convert them all. Now you got to write a converter. Now you got to look at them. Or you could run the disk image in a browser and just see what it looked like in context and try it. And I used to call it pure emulation. Now I tend to call it a preview. I try to set expectation. It's like you're looking at a GIF of a movie. It's not so much the movie, but like now you get an idea. Oh, it's an action adventure. And so these emulation in the browsers, yeah, look, if you're going to go try to run, we made this modification and we used a persistent file system for DOSBox, for the DOSBox emulations, not the MAME stuff, but the DOSBox. What that means is it's possible to save a game in the DOSBox, come back later in your browser and keep playing the game by reloading it. Because we were getting complaints that they couldn't do that. And of course you could say that's impossible. Don't do that. Doctor, don't do that. But what we ended up doing was making it work. But then, and it still works, like the complaints went away. But I discovered people were like coming to me and saying like, I'm running into some real problems beating this boss because it's rather flickery. And I'm like, well, yeah, it's an emulation. And wait a minute, how long have you been playing this? And they're like, oh, about a year. Like they've been playing the browser version of an RPG for a year, which is like not what it was designed for. But what it shows is like people want to interface with this history far beyond just like looking at it and being like, ain't that peachy keen? They want to like relive these places or live them for the first time. And so what I wanted with emulation in the browser was to make it boring. When I used to be proposing this, there are talks given by me in 2012 about like, we should really do this emulation in the browser thing. And I said, when somebody tells you that they found a funny recording of a live version done by a band and you give them a link, their first reaction isn't, oh my God, I'm getting music out of my browser. Like, that's crazy. Well, I can play it back and forth like it's a movie? That's crazy. They just go, yeah, guitarist sounds like he's drunk. Like they just don't care because it's transparent technology. And I wanted that for software. I wanted it that the time from, wait a minute, were they blue or green goblins on level 2 to you're playing it to be like 10 seconds, which it is now, right? You can go and boot up a console in a browser and there it is. And some of these games, you don't want to download the disk file, figure out how it works, find out that it requires a boot disk. And so you get the boot disk and like, no, you just want to go in and look at it. That's what it was for. Here's a hot take for you, just coming fresh off the griddle. I think the same mindset that doesn't take for granted that the released version of something is the only version and knows there must be other versions, or that if a game was rumored, it must be a real thing sitting on a hard drive, is the same mindset that can quickly pivot over to buying into made up lore. So they go, this is why this happened. This is where it's going. I heard this happened, and other people start reporting it. Like, it's really ripe for rumor mills because people are like, I overheard at this gaming convention from one of the original developers before his studio pivoted off it, that their original plan was that they were going to have network access, and there's dormant network code out there. We could have this thing up on network. So let's get going on the network code. Now I'm very angry about no network code. Where's my network code? And like watching that can be a very dangerous mutation. So to bring that back, like what I like about this, this approach to these projects is to go, no, here's what's going to happen. Here's what's going to happen. Like, this model is clearly not going to work. It's too complicated. That's why they cut it down. That's what happened. It wasn't, oh, there was once a sword and whatever. It's like, no, they put in a holder. You can see it's a holder. So if you look at a screenshot, it looks like a holder. It's like they never intended that to be the tree, man. There's no secret high-res version of that thing. Like it's evidence for crimes and events that never happened, right?
Yeah, sometimes what you see is what is really what you get.
And actually, magazines themselves were very often the source of those rumors because they were incentivized to embellish rumors about games. And very often, the bills that we actually get are nothing like the rumors. Like, I remember one thing was, what was it, like Sonic 2 CD?
Yes.
So one magazine said that Sega is coming out with Sonic 2 CD, and there were like screenshots of like stuff running on the Sega CD. And when we actually got that CD,
It was just like a
randomly,
it was a sizzle
it was
reel.
yeah, it was a tech demo of nothing. Like it had
Yeah.
nothing to do with Sonic other than there was like a sprite of Sonic.
Yeah, I think that we discussed this pre-roll. I'll just mention it here for your audience. So for those of you who are a little bit young and don't remember an actually healthy, for various values of healthy gaming press, one where it was an outcropping not dissimilar to sports, music, movies, and so on. An industry that is creative or creative new content is coming all the time, and it's the job of these different institutions to either fall into line and be a glorified promoter of those things, or to be an independent voice that could theoretically bring the juice when it was needed, right? Like it could totally report, like, I think this is happening. When it was that case, it was at an era where print magazines ruled. And the thing about print magazines that don't really translate to the modern era is shockingly long preparation times. And what I mean by that is you might have, let's say, I believe that to get a CD into the stores or to get a game into stores, certainly with Sears, which dates me, but other ones was you need to be in our warehouse by September. We need proof that you have these items by September. They need to be in our warehouse, or we will not put you in the Sears Christmas catalog and you will not be offered. And so there was a lot of pressure to like push things out months before. So even though you might say, "Hey, what are you doing, man? It's March, for Christmas." And it's like, no. We got to be locked in 6 months because it's going to go into a store. And I'll tell you one other Atari case of this. The Atari 400, which was the first Atari home computer, wanted to sell in Sears. And Sears said, "Nope, got to have it for September." So in September, they mailed them like a couple hundred Atari 400s with Atari 400 shells inside with no circuit boards. And then in October, issued a recall and said they had a bug with the computers. And so they took them back and replaced them. And that's how they got into the Christmas catalog in time. They gave themselves an extra 30 days. Like that kind of shenanigan can happen. Well, with gaming press, so therefore these games have to be ready to go September. But to be into a magazine, you've got to be usually, under most paradigms, 3 months ahead of that. So if you want to be in the August issue, talking about your new game that's going to come out in August, you got to be giving them the game to play. You got to be like sitting them down. You got to be able to answer their questions. As they became more savvy, they would assign people 24/7, like literally somebody whose job was to take a late night phone call at 1 a.m. when they're like, "I can't get over this level," and give them hints on how to help. I think you folks encountered this or have encountered this, unless I'm mistaken, pre or press version of the game with cheat codes and cheat modes, just to say, look, you just want to go to the end. Here you go. You want to fight the final boss. There you go. Final boss. And depending on the ethics and approach.
Or there were instructions to say, don't look at this. Like, don't play this level. Don't talk about this level. Don't talk about this part of the game. It's not reviewable yet.
Yeah. And so you've got this kind of relationship that's kind of built up because everybody, obviously there gets to be a falling into line over time, which is what happened with movies. So it's inevitable that under a commercially stressful situation like a high grade game thing, it's like, look, we're going to give you a special version of the game. It's going to do this. Give us a good review if you could. We really want this, but please understand, we understand that if this game turns out to be a dog, it makes you look bad. So we promise, we'll give you an exclusive with our developers the next time around if it doesn't work out. Like they're all negotiating, and like here's a person to call. Here's a manager. The dev guy will be ready for you. You can just call him at his house whenever you want. That stuff is kind of like nascent really in the 90s for these game companies where it's like pure. I mean, if you go look at like a scanned game magazine, and the answer is you can pretty much look at all of them now. I mean, people have scanned them all to within an inch of their life. And you just take a standard issue, like a 200 or 160 page issue that is just packed to the gills with text on every level, right? That's a break. What? That's for 1 month. That's August. Like at that breakneck pace, you're sweeping a lot under the rug. You are sticking a lot of stuff in a box to make it look heavy. I mean, you're doing your best. And one of the side effects of that are these broken, weird, not quite accurate, slightly overhyped games that now Hidden Palace comes along and is like, oh, what's the dealio with you? And this is how we understand our own history. This is how we can mythologize if we want, but we can also choose to see the truth if we want. I think that's the power of something like this, the power of having something like the Deluge. And I still remember watching the first Deluge stream because you guys had, just so people know, I mean, I didn't do anything. I didn't write any copy. I didn't demand a certain version. I didn't say do this. I was just caring about the protectant of the donors to make sure. And it was a lot of effort. If you could squint and infer sources, and it was a long time effort to clean it up because it was so much stuff. I mean, how do you check a room full of phone books to make sure somebody didn't leave a Post-it note in one of them? I mean, it was like that. And just every once in a while, it would be like, I don't know, like a photo would have like an identifying aspect to it. And it'd be like, we have to modify that photo. Like so much work for free.
Which, by the way, shout out to everyone who helped.
Yes. Yeah. The Deluge team, we couldn't have done that without them. If it was just like the three of us just looking through it all, I don't think we would have just passed on it, I think.
I mean, if you think about it, it's insane that, collectively we spent thousands of hours like building tooling, going through builds, taking screenshots, like picking out what to stream, right? Because you can't stream
that's the
all
hard
7,000, right?
That's the hard part, is because we don't have prior knowledge of a lot of these games. There might be a super fan out there of one of these games who doesn't know what we're doing until we do a stream for it. And we don't know they exist. So we kind of have to go in and
guess.
And yeah, we have to curate all of these builds to determine what's going to have the best impact when we present it. We have to be showmen at the end of the day. We have to be showmen, and we have to present this history in a way that gets people interested in the things we don't present.
Right. And sometimes it's significant because it's, Sonic and people lose their minds. But sometimes it's because, it's like the first version of this game that's ever been seen. And, there's like 12 people in the world that care about this game. But to them, this makes their entire year, or this is the most fun they will ever have on a stream, right? And
or it in the best case scenario, it unlocks something, and it unlocks a passion in them to pursue what we do.
Right. How many times have we, by releasing one build, like we kind of unlocked in someone the idea that, hey, well, we could actually go and find more. Like there's people now who go forth into the world and find builds because they saw it on stream.
They knew it could. Now they know it can happen. Now they know it exists. That gives them the push. That gives them the itch in their head to look further.
Yeah, I've had a real lot of pleasure with finding people who have been on a mission and they convince themselves that nobody understands them and nobody understands their motivations. And maybe they're not as good at, enunciating it as people like me tend to do, which is part of my job, though. Part of my job is helping put, words to paper to say, this is why this is done and this is the effect. And please understand that sometimes you won't find it as interesting, Like if you explain on paper what bird watchers do at the highest levels, you'd be like, that's insane. But for them, it is fundamentally important to capture these birds in the wild, to hear them in their native environment do their song. And no amount of shock that they drive this far or that they trade these sounds or whatever is going to maybe dissuade somebody. But maybe they'll find others who go, my favorite words are always, I thought I was the only one, because that's somebody saying it in a way that means I now know I'm no longer alone.
All right, we're going to try to land the plane here.
Oh, good job. Go for it, man. I always make a joke. My latest, I use it all the time joke is when people come up to talk to me at events, I go, look, man, people never say goodbye to me. They always say, I got to go.
We got to go.
Oh, wow. Okay, man. Are you sure? I got some great trivia for you for another hour.
We will certainly bring you back. Thank you, Saz. Thank you, DRX. Thank you, Jason Scott. Jason Scott, where can people listen to you talk more about stuff?
I have a podcast called Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, which is a weekly podcast where I just kind of do a little thoughtful essay. It's more like an essay more than anything else, about 10 to 15 minutes. Just whatever's on my mind, everything from a love affair with a home computer when I was 12, all the way through to why I think this reel-to-reel system I bought may be broken, whatever's on my mind. I'm up to episode 385. Okay, take your jaw off the floor. And you can find out wherever fine podcasts are delivered. Of course, I work at the Internet Archive, archive.org. Love that place. I am the founder of textfiles.com, textfiles.com. If you want to see bulletin board system era stuff, I also have made documentaries about the bulletin board system era, about adventure games, about the DEF CON hacking conference. All of them are open licensed. Go have a ball. Or, and I can appreciate this, go play a Sonic beta.
And you can find many such betas on hiddenpalace.org, where you can find the work of Saz and DRX and sometimes me. Thank you for listening.